not the Homer Simpson of MMA like you are, bro. I'm not gonna take a beating.
Who's gonna knock you down?
No one.
When are you gonna fight back?
Never.
What are you gonna do?
Nothing.
That's my boy.
Happy New Year, everybody. It's now 2026. This is Pac MMA, and it's finally time to talk about the main event of UFC 324, Justin Gaethje versus Paddy Pimblett in the first event of the Paramount era. For those who are relatively new to the channel, I like to do a straightforward breakdown of both fighters' strengths and weaknesses, which must be at least somewhat specific. I review some contextual details surrounding the fight, followed by a cross-examination of all that we've covered, and then a final prediction. So let's get started with longtime fan favorite and former interim lightweight champion and BMF title holder, Justin the Highlight Gaethje. Everyone knows Gaethje is pretty heavy-handed, not the heaviest, but heavy nonetheless. He also has heavy leg kicks, and I think those are the things that are worth mentioning in his striking arsenal here. I'll get more specifics when we get to that cross-examination. A stat that people have been quick to bring up in this matchup is the 68% takedown defense.
But if one man can hold you down, two.
Which is solid, and I think it will hold up versus Paddy Pimblett. Gaethje's chin has also since rejuvenated since the brutal Max Holloway sleepage all the way back at UFC 300, doing well to bounce back versus Rafael Fiziev. I know I'm not being terribly specific here, but more specifics. This time around, I'm saving most of it for the crossover analysis. Gaethje has continued to show his savviness in the clinch. He has great collar tie uppercuts, hooks, and sometimes even sprinkles some knees in there, and maybe even a head kick. So safe to say he's pretty solid in the clinch. Now, I think most of Justin Gaethje's weaknesses also go without saying. He's had some really non-existent submission defense, where most recently he was put in a mounted triangle against Rafael Fiziev in the rematch, but it wasn't like Fiziev was ever going to finish that, as he's not known for attacking submissions either, but still an extremely bad sign going into a matchup versus Pimblett, who has some of the better grappling chops in the division. Like, if we're being real, if Gaethje gives up any dominant position versus Pimblett, I am expecting him to get finished. Another relevant weakness in this fight is Gaethje's pretty bare bones range striking. He only really uses jabs and leg kicks from range, and typically those are pretty naked single strikes. He really relies on lunging or crashing in with his opponent to meet them in the pocket for exchanges. On top of all this, Gaethje is quite hittable, and his defense is also somewhat predictable. Versus Holloway, he was constantly showing this dip he loves to do, and Max punished him badly for it with uppercuts and eventually that gnarly spinning back kick that broke his nose at the end of round 1. Moving on to Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. The thing I could say about Paddy Pimblett after watching so much tape on him is that, frankly, he's a size merchant. Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, but I think that's the truth.
Well, you know, he's kind of fat.
He's one of the biggest lightweights in the division, and that's very evident by how he just outmuscles all these unks like Chandler and Tony. Paddy's also got some solid attacks from range, like his long teeps, jabs, and pretty solid leg kicks as well. He's got some of the most unorthodox, sort of elastic, funky striking in the division, but it certainly works for him. And he's also greatly improved his timing, especially in that Chandler fight. Paddy isn't the best wrestler, as we'll see later, but he is an amazing submission artist. Really solid ghillie to triangle transition versus Bobby Green, and he has a good submission win over Jordan Levitt, who is a decent grappler in his own right. He was also somewhat threatening the arm triangle versus Michael Chandler and a rear naked later in the same round, but it does seem like his submission threat could be limited to sort of flash submission finishes like it was versus Bobby Green. To speak on that Chandler performance again, Pimblett has a nasty top game with hard elbows and ground and pound, which allowed him to finish that fight versus Chandler pretty handily. But Pimblett does have his fair share of weaknesses since he's such a goofy goober at lightweight. For one, it's that chin. He sticks it up sky high in the air, and it's terribly distracting when he fights, as we'll go over in a minute, against a guy like Gaethje who's actually listed to be taller than Paddy, which I'm not sure if is true, but you will certainly be punished for abusing that tall man's defense of just gliding out of range with your chin pointed towards the ceiling. He is just too hittable, unanimously robbing Jared Gordon, getting rocked by Luigi Vendramini, and there were also some shots in that Chandler fight that could have possibly chinned him if Chandler were just an inch taller or so. Another thing that worries me about Paddy in this fight is that he's pretty flat-footed, and when I say he's truly a size merchant, I really meant it because Paddy almost completely leans on his size, his durability, and his explosiveness to brute through what would otherwise be a really dysfunctional and awkward style. I find it hard to believe that he'll be able to quickly evade and outslick even an out-of-prime Justin Gaethje. He's just too stiff and too static. Now, this is the point a lot of people are harping on, and that's Paddy's terrible offensive wrestling. Paddy has a 29% takedown accuracy, which is pretty abysmal considering Gaethje's solid takedown defense. Even when Paddy took down Chandler, it was only after he had already been rocked, and he never really attempted a real takedown before that. Now let's see where both of these guys are in their careers. Gaethje is currently 9-5 in the UFC with a record of 26-5 overall. All those losses have come at the hands of champions actually. Justin Poirier, interim title I know, Charles Oliveira, Eddie Alvarez, and Khabib Nurmagomedov. Gaethje has fought the who's who of the upper echelon of lightweight, and he's certainly battle tested. He's currently on a 1-fight win streak after his short notice rematch with Rafael Fiziev all the way back in March of 2025. Gaethje has 6 KOs in the UFC with only 3 decision wins over Michael Chandler and 2 being over Rafael Fiziev. Another big thing to consider here is that Justin is 37 and he hasn't necessarily shown his age, but who knows what it'll look like come 324. I was very worried he would look like a shell of himself versus Fiziev in the rematch after Holloway completely dismantled him, but he seemed to be renewed and looked just about the same as he always does. But with nearly a year's worth of time in between that and this fight, he may start showing that age and almost decades worth of damage. In the case of Paddy Pimblett, he's currently 7-0 in the UFC with an overall record of 23-3 with 5 finishes in the UFC, 2 KOs, and 3 submissions. He's currently on an overall 9-fight win streak going into this interim title fight. The most glaring thing about his current run is that none of the fighters on his resume are elite, and none of the decent names were in their prime, and they were all on losing streaks. Michael Chandler, Tony Ferguson, Bobby Green, and Jared Gordon, who as of late became more of a win one, lose one kind of guy. Overall, his resume has been pretty fraudulent, especially in comparison to that of Gaethje, who's fought the very best. He's 7 years younger than Gaethje, being 30 years old, which is one of his biggest advantages here. Alright, now it's time for the fun part now, for the nitty gritty, analyzing specific techniques between the two to see how they might match up. This will primarily be a striking focused breakdown since I don't think Gaethje will fare much of a chance at all versus Pimblett on the ground. Like I don't think I have to go very in depth on that, and I've already sort of skimmed over that Pimblett's not highly likely to take Gaethje down. But one thing to mention about the grappling is that Gaethje does throw his kicks very naked. This was an issue he had closer to the beginning of his career, but it's still somewhat of a tendency in his game. This ended up punishing him in the Fiziev rematch as Gaethje would get his kick caught twice, getting taken down by Fiziev of all people. Fiziev is shown to have a grappling arsenal versus a guy like Bahamondes, which really just were like a few takedowns, but Bahamondes himself is not a great anti-grappler either, so hard to credit that as Fiziev having amazing offensive grappling. But even though this is a pretty glaring weakness for Gaethje, I don't think Paddy Pimblett is as talented as a guy like Fiziev, who's done Muay Thai for like the majority of his life, is much more athletic, and is pretty used to catching kicks. I don't think a guy like Paddy, who is super upright in his stance, is going to crouch all the way down to catch Gaethje's kicks. But it is something to mention, and if Paddy does end up taking that approach, he could definitely take Gaethje down. But moving on to the striking elements, as I mentioned before, Paddy's improved his striking a fair bit since the start of his career, but he's still super stiff and awkward. But what he's had a ton of success with, especially versus Michael Chandler, was his timing. He was constantly going for these rear uppercuts versus Chandler as the shorter man who likes to level change a lot. He was also using the uppercut in combinations, both as counters and as pressing offense, which is why Gaethje's defensive tendencies may be an issue here. I referred to this dipping motion Gaethje tends to do, which was punished extremely badly by Holloway, and now Paddy Pimblett is certainly not Max Holloway, but he can at least replicate half of the success he had with punishing that dip with the same uppercuts that busted up Chandler. But to expand on this comparison, Pimblett is so static and pretty much all of his initiative comes in blitzes and single strikes. He only ever unloads volume when he's already smelling blood in the water. Like the reason why Holloway had so much success versus Gaethje was his movement. He was constantly making Gaethje work to catch him, and Paddy simply just doesn't move the same way. Although Paddy is unorthodox, I feel like for the most part, a lot of Gaethje's go-to weapons are right there for him to abuse versus Pimblett. I mentioned earlier that Chandler was landing a few shots that could have clipped Paddy badly if he had some different attributes, and one of those strikes was the left hook. I know I keep bringing up Paddy's stance and his movement, but it really is his biggest hindrance in this matchup versus a guy like Gaethje, who also stands very straight up and is about the same height as him. And Gaethje has put on a decent amount of size in the past couple years, and it's shown in his bouts with Fiziev, who's now considered small for the lightweight division. But back to the left hook, this is one of Gaethje's prime weapons, and one he catches pretty much everybody with. It's typically the initial shot before he hurts his opponent with a big right hand, which is exactly how he finished both James Vick and Cowboy Cerrone back in the day. But more recently, he also landed this plenty on Poirier in the rematch, but all this to say is that Gaethje reliably throws the left hook hard and lands it on most opponents. punches, and Paddy Pimblett was getting caught with it quite a bit with this same punch versus guess who? Short, stubby Michael Chandler. Paddy was getting caught with this a little too often in the middle of exchanges by old man Chandler, and I think it's pretty alarming considering current Gaethje is definitely faster than current Chandler. And with that, I think my final prediction is pretty evident. Honestly, a lot of people are making it out like Gaethje is being underrated versus Paddy, but in reality, I feel like Paddy has so much more to prove here. He has to prove that he has offensive wrestling, because otherwise the only way he'll be able to get into a grappling scenario is through pulling guard or just somehow goofing his way into a scramble, and he has to prove he can beat someone who is at least reliably high level and can compete with good top echelon talent in the division. Obviously, the odds don't reflect this because they just see Paddy as a grappler and Gaethje as a fighter who always loses to grapplers, but I think this is the odd exception. Charles was able to submit Gaethje because he was actually more powerful and more aggressive on the feet, and he was able to outdo Gaethje in the clinch with knees and threaten guard pulls to recover, or even just sit and wait on his back even if he did end up getting hurt. But Gaethje himself didn't get that luxury, so when Charles dropped him, it was a lot simpler for Charles to follow up and get the finish. I don't believe Paddy has the same power, nor the striking kit that Charles does, to command the respect and inflict the same kind of damage he did to Gaethje in order to force that submission finish. And on the feet, I feel like Paddy is just too inactive. He has never fought someone as big and as powerful as Gaethje, and someone who won't sort of just stop trying to win after the first couple of minutes of a round like Michael Chandler did in their fight. And although Paddy has the tools like some of his counterpunching, the longer weapons like his kicks and jabs, it's just not going to be enough to discourage a guy like Gaethje who thrives off of that you go, I go rhythm. And that's exactly the issue he had versus Holloway. Max really never let Gaethje breathe for a second, constantly showing him different looks, moving laterally, attacking the body, and being way harder to hit than that of Paddy. It's honestly hard to pick Gaethje because I've always been of the opinion that his power is slightly overrated, but I think with Paddy being as defensively irresponsible as he is, I think Gaethje will have the opportunity to land that perfect shot. I think the old dog will get this one done, and I'm picking Justin Gaethje by second round KO. It's just too hard to trust Paddy's striking defense, offense, and his ability to wrestle on top of all this, whereas Justin, I'm mainly concerned with him showing his age and his defense falling apart and getting caught with something goofy, but I don't think that's highly likely. There is a part of me that thinks about some of my other predictions, and it's just like, don't overthink the details and just go with the favorite, just go with the easier pick. But I don't know, I can't really help it. I just feel like good old Rufus has a shot here. So what do you guys think of my prediction and breakdown? Do you have Justin Gaethje getting it done, or is Paddy Pimblett going to show up in the lightweight division? Leave your thoughts down in the comments below. I do plan to make a breakdown on Sean O'Malley versus Song Yadong, since I think that's a very interesting matchup, as well as potentially Arnold Allen versus John Silva. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Pac MMA. Goodbye.